everyone with us for another great talk on water issues. As you have just been hearing, we've been doing this for a long time. I think about 20 years now. I think Mike Trojan, who is now gone, um, originally had the idea of putting a water issues seminar together, and we are still doing it month to month. So it's great to continue it. We have with us this morning Maddie Nyblade from the University of Minnesota. She describes herself as a settler from Pennsylvania here in Minnesota, where she completed her Bachelor of Science degree in geoscience at Penn State. She's going to talk this morning to us about her graduate research studies that focused on the impacts of climate and land use change on wild rice across the Upper Great Lakes region. Her studies have been done in partnership with tribal nations, in addition to what she refers to as quote unquote holistic frameworks, which I'm interested to hear more about for researching wild rice. She's going to share with us the results of her latest collaborative work on this important topic. She's going to be finishing up her PhD at the U of M, and she says she gives her final defense in November, and then she's going to be going off to New York, where she's going to be going to Syracuse, the environmental studies at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So we get to hear from her in her important and interesting work this morning. Maddie, thanks for taking the time to come and tell us about what you've been doing. Take it away.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for being here. Let me see. I guess I have to grant access. This is my first time using WebEx, so
Yeah, there's a button there somewhere. I think it's,
no, it says opens.
I don't have that in front of me. Let's see, is there a button on the bottom that says share?
It's I have to grant it access. Sorry. Oh. Okay, it's saying that I have to leave the meeting and then come back in, which is embarrassing. So I'll be right back.
Oh, okay. All right. We will wait. We will all wait. That means, Brooke, you have to fill the time and
I have to
regale
fill the
us
time.
and regale
Wow.
us with things salt-wise.
Yeah. Well, I can give a little update that we were at the Children's Water Festival yesterday at the State Fairgrounds. So we do it, I don't know, we've been doing it for I think the last 5, 6 years. And we got to work with different classes of fourth graders and teach them all about salt and how to be scientists. So we give them little conductivity pens and tell them that we're training them in to be our future scientists to monitor the health of our waters. And so they have a lot of fun stirring the buckets, and they always want to pour more salt in.
Seems like
But
just
it was great. So
hugely,
I think I just have
hugely
to say my
effective
favorite
work.
part is one of the girls when we were getting done was walking by me and she's like, "This was really fun. I think I might want to do this when I grow up." And I was like,
Great.
"Oh my gosh, do you want to go out and like test water and like collect samples?" And oh, that's awesome. So that was like, oh, that's what makes going out and doing that day so worth it. It was like, right? There's one kid there that hopefully is inspired to go on to help protect the environment in their future. So anyway, that was a very exciting moment for me yesterday. So there we go. We did it. Filled the time.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well
Is it
done.
working now?
It is working.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
I'm not going to take the time to introduce you again because
No,
we already did that. So I think
it's something weird
I
on
think
my
the floor
end
is yours.
with the permissions, but I think I got it set up.
Right.
This is the first time using WebEx. Okay. Well, thank you all, and thanks for bearing with me as I clumsily start this presentation. I'm really excited to share with you and my latest work. I know several of you have seen me present. I was thinking maybe even 3 times before, so thank you for showing up again if you've seen me present, and hopefully I can share some new work and expand on what I've been doing in a longer form talk so that it's still interesting to you. But as Mark said, I'm Maddie Nyblade. I'm a settler. I descended from European American settlers in central Pennsylvania. I went to undergrad at Penn State, and now I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus in Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I have the privilege of participating and doing my graduate work as part of a big collaboration between the University of Minnesota researchers and tribes and intertribal organizations, many of whom are their seals are pictured here, in a collaborative called Kawe Gada Na Na Gada Wendamin Manoomin, which translates from Ojibwe to first we must consider wild rice. So Manoomin is the Ojibwe word for wild rice. Psiη is the Dakota word. And I'm here to share some stories about this work and the science of doing this collaborative work together. First, I want to acknowledge it's a huge project team. The work I'm sharing is a reflection of so many people's work that I've had the honor to work alongside as well as learn from. So it's not my own work that I share, it's the work of many, and I'm really grateful to be with such a wonderful team. On our project, we strive to bring together Western or mainstream science. That's the science that I grew up with, the science that's really dominant at the university and at the MPCA. And we try to bring that together with traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And what I mean by TEK is the science that's within Indigenous knowledge systems about the environment. And so we work with Ojibwe nations, and so we're thinking about environmental knowledge grounded in the Ojibwe knowledge system. And these are two different ways of seeing that we're looking, two different knowledge systems that we're looking to bring together. And the history of Western science and research has largely been one that uses Western science to support the goals of colonization at the harms of Indigenous peoples. And so we recognize that this is the past, and in some cases, the current use of Western science. And so we're actively trying to subvert that and bring these two ways of knowing together to support Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And the way we strive to do this is by learning from Indigenous scientists who have put forth ways of doing this, one of which is Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer. She shares a metaphor of the Three Sisters garden, of a way to bring different ways of knowing together, where we have the corn, which grows tall and strong as the traditional ecological knowledge, grounding the work in values and providing this intellectual scaffold for the work. And the Western science, or the mainstream science, is like the beans. It provides really useful and specific information, but needs direction and guidance. And bringing these two together is like the corn is the intellectual scaffold, the TEK, the Western sciences, the bean following the leadership of the corn. And when I say bring these two together, it does not mean diminish one or the other. It means fully engaging in the rigor and logics of those knowledge systems, but guiding by traditional ecological values and bringing the different ways of knowing together to strengthen the overall research. And then in the metaphor, we also have the squash, which shades out the garden from other weeds, creating a culture of collaboration and respect. And so the way that I have come to visualize and think about our work is through this series of concentric circles, where together the tribal resource managers and tribal members and the university of researcher staff and students and faculty have come together and have a core set of values that ground our community practices, that build relationships of trust and respect. From these places, we can share knowledge with each other and talk and explore and come up with research questions and hypotheses together in a research collaboration. And then from that place, we can choose methods within different knowledge systems that are appropriate and respectful for answering those research questions and testing those hypotheses. We can employ those methods within the full rigor of the discipline of the knowledge system that they are part of, and then bring those results back to the research collaboration to discuss what it means, what are the limitations, are there other ways to look at this, and really strengthen and flesh out those methods and results. And then there's an iterative process from there. So I'm going to walk through our research process and share some stories on how we do this work, as well as get to some modeling results and work that I've been doing for my dissertation. So we have many values on this project. Here are 6 that we have defined as really important to us. The first being humility, recognizing that we all bring knowledge and value to the table, but we are not, we just are one part of the whole, and having that humility to recognize that Western science doesn't know everything. It is valuable, but it is just one way of knowing. And Indigenous knowledge, likewise, is another way of knowing that holds value and doesn't hold all the answers. Reciprocity is another value. Personal connections with each other, with place, with Manoomin. Understanding and respecting our interrelatedness and the spirit of the places, the people, the beings involved in this work. And of course, working towards healing and justice in this work, which I will touch on as we go. I want to first start by reaffirming, acknowledging, emphasizing that tribes are sovereign nations. They are sovereign nations before US colonization, and currently and present day. They have always been sovereign nations. And this sovereignty is connected with the land. Their lifeways, their languages, their knowledge systems, all connected with this land and is part of their sovereignty. In the picture to the left, we have folks at Prairie Island, which is a Dakota community in the southeast part of Minnesota, harvesting Psiη, which is the Dakota word for wild rice. And then on the right here, we have a picture of Joe Gravine over at Lac du Flambeau in Wisconsin, parching wild rice, or Manoomin in Ojibwe. Both pictures showing present day practices of connections to the land that is connected to this sovereignty for both Dakota and Ojibwe nations across Minnesota. Importantly, Manoomin is a cultural foundation and sacred relative to the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe people are one of 3 people in the Anishinaabe, so the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe are all Anishinaabe, and they migrated from the East Coast through the Great Lakes, and the Ojibwe came here to the Upper Great Lakes region because of Manoomin, because of the amount of wild rice growing here and the gifts it has to offer to people. This picture here on the left is of Perch Lake on the Fond du Lac Reservation, and you can see that when Manoomin is abundant, it blankets the lake. And this whole expanse here is a lake, and it's covered in wild rice. Wild rice goes through many different life stages. It's got this purple, beautiful flower here. And when it's harvested, it has a hull, and then there's a series of processes to remove that hull and have the rice be ready to eat. The old picture here is also of traditional bundling practices, a way of protecting the rice and marking family rice beds. So Psiη, Manoomin, or wild rice's range is extensive, but it has been shrinking in abundance. So this map here is of North America, Turtle Island. We see in the purple to yellow range mapped, outlined in white, the range of Zizania palustris, which is the scientific name for northern wild rice. In yellow, we have higher density, and to the purple, which is lower density. There are other species of wild rice in North America. We have Zizania aquatica, more southern wild rice, and you can see that the range for Zizania aquatica is mapped in this hashed black line. And then there's also Zizania texana, which is a remnant population in Texas. That is also, the range is also mapped here. And so while Manoomin has grown and grows across North America, its presence has been shrinking. There's one study that shows that it's shrunk by about 1/3 in Minnesota and Wisconsin from 1900 to 2006. I also want to acknowledge and name that Manoomin, the Psiη, and I am currently on Dakota land, Oceti-Sakowin, so the people connected linguistically, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota languages. This is their homelands. Psiη shares this land with the Dakota people, and it's important to their lifeways and sovereignty. So this blue area, shaded area, is the Oceti-Sakowin traditional territory, as well as several more communities within that also marked on this map. We are also in Anishinaabe territory, and Manoomin is across Anishinaabe territory, marked here in red. And they have a sacred relationship, as I mentioned, with Manoomin. And importantly, there are many other Indigenous people across North America. This is pulling all the territories from the website nativeland.ca, which is an awesome website. I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in looking up Indigenous lands and traditional territories. But you can see many Indigenous peoples across North America, many of whom also have relationships, whether directly or through trade, with wild rice. And we're also thinking about on this land, the settler nation, the United States. So in the hot pink color here, I have marked out all of the land cession treaties that the US has signed with Indigenous nations. Notice that the East Coast is not covered with land cession treaties because the treaties were signed between the British and the Indigenous people, so they're not on this map. But recognizing that when we're thinking about this, we're also thinking about those treaties and the settler nation of the United States. So to ground us where we are right now, we are in the heart of Psiη Manoomin homeland. Again, that yellow color is the more abundant region of the higher density for Manoomin. On this map, again, the hot pink color is the land cession treaty boundaries, and I've listed out all of the treaties on the right here, and then the tribal lands are in the lighter purple color. Ojibwe tribes retain the right to harvest Manoomin in these ceded territories, and this is explicit in some of the treaties, such as the Treaty of 1837, which explicitly says they retain the right to gather wild rice even off of their reservation. So recognizing they have this legal right to Manoomin even outside of their reservations. And another important background piece for this story is that the University of Minnesota has contributed to and benefited from Indigenous land dispossession through land grants given under the Morrill Act that has funded the endowment of the university. The university has also contributed to research that has contributed to Manoomin habitat degradation, as well as pursued cultivation of wild rice research and genetics research without full tribal consultation. And this is a really big issue because all of these things combined speak to the harm that the university has caused or contributed to towards Indigenous nations. And is why part of our goal in this project is working towards healing and justice in this. And there's a lot to be said here, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. And so from this background, we have come together as several tribal nations and intertribal treaty organizations, as well as researchers at the university, to form the collaborative Kawe-Gada Nanaga Dawendamin Manoomin. Again, that translates from Ojibwe to First We Must Consider Wild Rice. And we study 6 sets of lakes across the region, very in depth, studying water levels and geochemistry, as well as working with these tribal nations and intertribal organizations to do research more regionally. So from our values and from that background, we engage in community practices that build a foundation and relationship of trust and respect. I'm not going to walk through all of the community practices, but I will share some. First, we have a protocol for responsible and ethical research that is part of the memorandums of understanding we have signed with tribal nations. That we have this to hold researchers accountable to respecting tribal sovereignty and name the rights and responsibilities that each party has in the relationship. This is especially speaking towards the fact that researchers in the past and presently often work to support their own goals and often at the harm or expense of Indigenous nations. So our goal is to not do that, to explicitly benefit or explicitly do work that respects tribal sovereignty, and name that and strive to work towards that and hold ourselves accountable to doing that. There's a lot of pieces of this. This is just a quick summary, and you can find the whole protocol in our paper. that was published in 2021. One thing I want to name is the importance of data ownership. Tribes are sovereign nations and have the right to own their own data, often talked about as data sovereignty. And so we are explicit about data ownership. The university also has policies on what data the university owns if university members are part of it, collecting it. And that's been really complicated and tough to navigate. So we try to be honest and upfront about what legal constraints there are. And if tribes are uncomfortable with us collecting data, because the university has to at least be co-owner in that data, then we do not collect the data. And this is something that we try to be upfront and explicit about and work to find ways to make sure tribes can own their own data and respect tribal sovereignty. Another important community practice is visiting the field, being out in these places together, being with Manoomin, harvesting, measuring water levels, measuring pore water geochemistry together, paddling the rivers. This is where we can connect as people, we can connect with Manoomin and understand why it's so important. We can hear the stories from tribal members about how these landscapes have changed, what patterns they've noticed, often from generations of people out and connected to these landscapes. And this is where we really have been able to share and build trust with each other and learn deeply from one another. We also engage in ceremony when invited by tribal members. One ceremony we regularly participate in is the gifting of tobacco, or asema, which serves as this reminder to researchers before we go out on the water that we need to act with respect and reciprocity. Science is often, we're out there measuring water levels or taking water samples, and it's extractive. We're taking from the landscape, and we're taking from Manoomin. And so before we go out on the water, we put down some tobacco to settle ourselves and remind that this work is in reciprocity, is not just about taking, and acknowledges our obligation to also give back to these places. We also have regular meetings. This is an important community practice. We meet on Zoom monthly. This is a photo that always makes me smile from it's 2020, deep within the pandemic. So many Zoom meetings, but we stayed connected and we have monthly meetings, regular check-ins to make sure that we're updating each other on the progress and getting feedback as we move forward as a project team. We've also hosted knowledge exchange workshops, which have been a really important way of sharing knowledge. So these photos are from a knowledge exchange workshop held last year at Lac du Flambeau. Half of the knowledge exchange workshop, the university researchers and students hosted different tables with demonstrations of their research methodologies and practices. So in the center here, you can see Dance, a graduate student, sharing about her geochemistry work with the community. And then in the upper right corner, you have Serena sharing about different aquatic plants. And then in the afternoon, we learned from tribal elders about different traditional practices, such as making knocking sticks for harvesting rice or tanning deer hides. We also had a river cleanup as part of the knowledge exchange as well, which is what the top picture is with all of the nets. So creating a space where we can share knowledge back and forth as equals and learn from each other. So grounded in those values, putting those values into practice through community practices, we then can collaborate in research. And what I mean by this is from this space of relationship, we can come up with research questions, conceptual frameworks, and hypotheses together. We can then choose methods, again, employ those methods within the rigor of the discipline that they come from, and then bring the results from those methods back to the project team to discuss limitations, meanings, and interpretations. And so our work has grown stronger and our science has grown more interesting and deepened because of this collaboration. And so I'm going to walk you through our process of how we collaborate, the step-by-step process of deliberation that bridges these different ways of knowing, and then walk you through how our science has changed and our way of thinking about Manoomin has changed because of this collaboration. And then I will share some of the statistical models that I've been working on. So first, as I said, we're out in the field collecting water samples, collecting water, putting out sensors to measure water levels. We're also in the field sharing stories. And so my field notebooks are filled with measurements, but as well as notes from stories or comments that people have shared with me while we're out in the canoe of like, oh, I remember when this used to be like this. I wonder why, or I think that's connected to this, or the beavers have done this year. Just writing as much as I can down. We bring the samples and the pressure the pressure transducers back to the lab, back to the university, process the data, make some plots, write up a draft report that also summarizes a lot of the notes that the stories that have been shared, so the quantitative and qualitative data, and share this back with the partners that we are working with to hear their take. First of all, did we hear those stories correctly? What can we learn from them? And then also, what does this data mean? So we, for example, will present some water level data and there'll be an odd spike in the middle of the summer. And we're curious, as the scientists who weren't there all summer, but did put out the sensor, why is there a spike in the middle of the summer? And we're talking with our tribal partners like, oh, there was a floating bog that got clogged the outlet. That's probably why the water level changed at that time. And that is the local knowledge that we wouldn't have, but that bringing together, we can make sense of that data. And that's just one example of how we talk through this data. But we think about it from all different angles. And from that, we come up with new questions and hypotheses and make a plan for the next season fieldwork on how we can test those or what we should be measuring, given all of our knowledge together and how we're thinking about things. And through all of this collaboration, there's a lot of our way of thinking changes. And so the way I've been able to capture that is through conceptual model building. And so you can see here several pictures of different conceptual models we have put together through time that are trying to connect all of the ideas we discuss in different ways, bringing both the Western science and Ojibwe ecological knowledge together. And of course, this is a cycle and continues each year. And we also have social scientists on our team who are studying this process alongside us. And they've put words to some of the processes that are ongoing. Again, first it starts with respecting, and then we're able to share. But we often have to contextualize what we're sharing. What does this number mean? What unit? What does that where does that story fit in? And then deliberating, what does that mean? Asking questions, relating it to what we know, relating it to what we saw that season, relating it to other papers that we've read, and then applying it to the next field season, applying it to research questions and deepening the research. And so to walk you through, this is the iterative process that's been happening throughout my PhD and before me, and hopefully will continue after me. And I'm going to show you how it has changed our research as Western scientists. So the Western scientist, my advisor, started off this research project concerned about sulfate and thinking about questions of sulfate cycling. And this was the conceptual diagram she included in the proposal when they started. And so to map out some of the things they were thinking about here on the left, we see thinking about sediment, iron, sulfate, organic matter related to toxins that impact Manoomin, and starting to think about groundwater and geology impacts. But from these conversations with tribal resource managers and tribal members, we realized there's so many more components and qualities needed to support Manoomin health, such as space to grow, low levels of herbivory, winters mattered, water levels mattered, seed banks and nutrients mattered. It was much more complicated than just toxins. And in fact, tribal resource managers told us, they had a pretty good understanding that sulfate impacted rice, but sulfate was just one reason, or sulfate was not why rice was declining in a lot of places. And so they wanted a more holistic approach to understanding why Manoomin was declining and how we could better protect it. So they encouraged us to think more broadly. And so from these habitat requirements, we started to talk and learn about how it was interconnected with swans and geese, with rice worms, with beavers and wolves, thinking about how droughts impact sediment and sediment mixing and available nutrients, how carp and muskrat come into play, how snowfall impacts the amount of spring water levels, which impacts sediment mixing, as well as cattails and pickerel weeds. And so you can see that our thinking has expanded and gotten more complex. And one thing we consistently heard was this impact of climate change and how climate change impacts water, impacts precipitation, impacts the winter, impacts storms. And tribal resource departments, several of them had put out vulnerability assessments and identified Manoomin as highly to extremely vulnerable to climate change. And so this is a picture from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, their vulnerability assessment, defining Manoomin as vulnerable. And importantly, people are also part of this system. People are contributing positively to Manoomin abundance through restoration and other caretaking efforts, but also negatively through gray infrastructure, through deforestation, through agricultural land use practices. And also researchers and policymakers and educators and harvesters are all part of this system that is connected with Manoomin. And so you can see that our narrow focus of Western science expanded to a more holistic picture. And at this point, I was mapping out all of the connections that I had heard from conversations and was really, I guess, sort of really proud that I'd been able to map this all out and seeing everything is interconnected. And I was excited about how I could show everything was interconnected. And I was sharing this model with our project team and tribal resource managers. And one tribal member shared that Melanie Montano shared with me. She was like, "This is great, Maddie, but it's not grounded in an Ojibwe worldview." And I was kind of struck. I was like, "Oh, well, I thought I was prioritizing all this interrelatedness, and that was learning from an Indigenous worldview." But here I was getting this feedback. And so I paused and I asked her what she would recommend. And she connected me with Psiη, who we have been collaborating with for the past 2 years to rebuild this from an Ojibwe worldview. And so this is the model that he has worked on developing with me based on the medicine wheel framework from an Ojibwe worldview. At the center, we have Manoomin's Minnow Bavada Ziwin, Manoomin's Good Life. On the eastern direction, the yellow, we have Manoomin Ake, which is a person who harvests wild rice. In the southern direction, we have Gidinawe Magdamin, which is all our relations, so birds, plants, insects, and everything. And then to the western direction, we have Aki, which is like earth, land, so thinking about water, sediment, climate. And then in the northern direction, we have Manoomin. And all of these things come together to support Manoomin's good life. And when he first showed this to me, I thought it was cool, but I was struck. I was like, Psiη, where are all the lines connecting everything? Don't you need the lines? I had worked so hard on mapping out all the lines. And this started this piece of learning for me where when I was really concerned about drawing all these lines because I'm coming from a Western worldview where things are assumed to be disconnected. And so what I was doing was drawing out all the lines of how everything is connected, reminding us that everything in fact is interconnected. In an Ojibwe worldview, it's more inherently understood, this fundamental interconnectedness. And so those lines weren't necessary in this medicine wheel model because they were already understood. And so I've come to see these two models as two sides to something like embroidery, where this medicine wheel is the front side that's organized and grounded in an Ojibwe worldview, recognizing the inherent interconnectedness. And on the back side of the embroidery, where you can see all the crisscrossing strings and how everything's interconnected, you can see this complex model. And so that is just one thing I've been learning from this medicine wheel model. Another important thing is that Inherently, people are included in this understanding of Manoomin's good life. Manoomin is in the eastern direction. In the eastern direction, we also associate with the youngest of people, the babies. And then as we have young people in the south, adult or teenagers in the south, western would be adults, and then elders in the north. So we're positioning Manoomin as the elder. It knows what it wants. Our goal is to listen. And people are integral in this, but we are the youngest here. We have the most to learn. So this medicine wheel model reminds us to bring humility to this work and learn from all of the other directions on how to support Manoomin's good life. And so what I've come to see is that the Western science that we do is merely one slice of this whole medicine wheel model. It's an important slice and it's helpful and provides useful information, but it is just a slice, and it's important to understand this holistic system as well as the narrow Western science. And as Joe said, Western science is like slicing a pickle or a cucumber to go study it. You miss the whole broader picture of what you're researching. So to jump in to the statistical modeling that I've been doing for my dissertation, I've asked 3 questions, again, recognizing these are just slices of the medicine wheel model. And in fact, this medicine wheel model points out that I'm missing all of our relations altogether. I'm not thinking about other beings in this research. And so that calls forth more research that's needed. So the first question is, how is Manoomin abundance changing across the region? Second one is, how has climate and land use change impacted Manoomin density? And then the third, which I think is really important, is how is this impacting tribal harvesters? This last question, I think, would often be skipped maybe by traditional Western scientists, but this medicine wheel model, our tribal partners have encouraged us that it's important, the impact on tribal harvesters, and really understanding that, because people are an important part of this story. So our first hypothesis is that there's a significant decline, but there's a lot of natural cycles in abundance. And for sake of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster through some of this, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So Manoomin is an annual plant. This is the picture of its life stages with the Ojibwe words for each life stage. And you can see that it grows from a seed each year. It has a submerged stage in the spring. By the end of May, it's in a floating leaf stage through mid-July. It then emerges and flowers, and then is ready for harvest by the end of August. And so my second set of hypotheses is that we'll see greater Manoomin density with lower winter mean temperatures and more snow, again, drawing from that traditional knowledge that winters are important. Harsher winters relate more positively to Manoomin abundance. And then specifically ice duration, since that is the in the lake process that's happening with colder winters. I also heard about the sensitivity of Manoomin during that floating leaf stage, that it needs lower water levels because it needs 1 to 3 feet, but lower water levels are better, so that because it requires less energy for the plant to grow to the surface. And of course, water levels are impacted by hydrology, but also precipitation. So less precipitation during that floating leaf stage would relate positively to Manoomin abundance. And then also more days above 4 degrees Celsius. So more growing degree days. And this is coming from Western ecology, where more warmer days, more time for the plant to grow means more abundance. Also looked at land use. And so our hypotheses were less development, more forested area, and less agricultural area in the watershed would relate positively to abundance. And this work has been done in partnership with Graceland, an undergraduate. And then the last hypothesis is that we'll see greater tribal harvest with increased Manoomin abundance. Okay, so to jump into methods, again, our project has a lot of different methods. I'm just going to be focusing on the statistical analysis. I've pulled together tribal, state, and federal data from across the region. For the sake of time, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I'm happy to answer questions. From this data, we see that there is a decline of total Manoomin available for harvest. So for the top graph, we have 1854. So this is the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. We have Fond du Lac and then Gliffwick which is northern Wisconsin. Each color here is a different water body. On the x-axis, we have year. On the y-axis, we have total number of Manoomin stocks. And you can see that just generally there is a decline over these several decades. You can also see there's a lot of variation between years. And if you look closely, you can also see that a lot of this density decline is driven by a few lakes. And that's still means that there's less to harvest each year. And that is important because we're thinking about the rice available for harvest. But it also raises the question of, is there an overall pattern at all of these lakes rather than just being dominated by a few lakes? So because there's a lot of variance, and we heard that in traditional knowledge, there is a 4-year cycle generally of Manoomin abundance, Maya Gilchrist, who's at the MPCA when she was in grad school with me, also helps with this work to analyze the multi-year cycles and see if there was any cycles that were statistically significant. And so this work showed that most lakes, 67%, had a significant multi-year cycle. The most common was 3 years. And then there were longer cycles that were several decades. There's less confidence in this because there's less years. There's only a few decades of data tested, but I do include this because there is traditional knowledge showing or saying that there are longer decadal cycles of Manoomin as well. So because of this variability, I chose to use the model of generalized additive models. Happy to talk more. Again, I'm just going to speed through the methods to show the results to you in my last couple minutes here. I did several different models to test out all of these different hypotheses that I've talked about. And so some of the key takeaways from these models is that we do see that Manoomin density and off-reservation tribal harvest has declined over the last several decades. So this is across every lake. This is a pattern that we see statistically significant at every lake. So on the x-axis for all of these graphs, we have year, and on the y-axis for the top, we have density, and then on the y-axis for the bottom two, we have pounds per trip. All of the orange graphs are Glyphwick data. The blue graph is 1854 Treaty Authority data. And GAMs work by testing multiple variables at the same time. And so the density, so the x-axis is a layered effect. This is what's happening on top of individual site-specific trends at each lake. So we can see that there is a decline in density that's significant at every lake across these decades, and it's about a 1 stock per meter squared decline. We also see that there is a clear decline in tribal off-reservation harvest, but there's not really a clear decline in non-tribal off-reservation harvest. I'm giving a presentation. Sorry about that. Also, there is a significant relationship between precipitation and Manoomin density. So the way we can look at this, again, orange contributes with, or relates to Glyphwick data. Blue is 1854. We see that there, on the y-axis, we have the partial effect on Manoomin density. And each of the columns represent a different life stage of Manoomin. And so we can see that during the submerged stage, this first left column, precipitation actually has 2 different effects. So it's a positive effect for the Glyphwick data, negative effect for the 1854 data. And so that's a complicated effect. So there's different things happening during that submerged stage. During the floating leaf stage, we see a consistent negative effect in precipitation for both Glyphwick and 1854, and also a significant impact of water levels. So higher precipitation, higher water levels during this floating leaf stage relate negatively to wild rice. There is no significant relationship with the emergent stage, and then there's a slight positive relationship with snowfall, but nothing significant. I also looked at temperature and winter temperature, growing degree days, and ice duration. We see that there's a positive relationship between ice duration and Manoomin density. The temperature relationships are not super significant. We see with Glyphwick, there's a somewhat significant negative relationship with growing degree days, and then a negative relationship with winter temperatures and 1854 Treaty Authority data. So warmer winters, less rice. We also saw an increased Manoomin density related positively to pounds harvested per trip. So greater Manoomin density, more pounds harvested per trip. It declines here at the end with higher densities. And I think, and from experience, I can say that it's harder to harvest rice at really dense quantities. So it makes sense that you could get less pounds per trip at really dense rice. So just to summarize the results, we see somewhat some relationships with snow, but not really that significant. Lower winter temperatures for the 1854 Treaty Authority data related positively to rice abundance. Greater ice duration related positively to rice abundance. Less precipitation and lower water levels during that floating leaf stage related positively to rice abundance, and less days above 4 degrees Celsius related positively, but also was not super strong. And then with greater abundance, we see more pounds harvested per trip. And if we look at climate change, we see that there's less ice cover in the past and there will continue to be. And we also see warmer winters and more precipitation during that early summer stage. And so we can see that climate change has in the past and will continue to impact rice. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through some of the land use stuff. This is still preliminary. Nothing is super strong compared to the climate. We do see a relationship with evergreen forest, but I think some of my challenges with the land use have to do with the fact that my watersheds, the watersheds I'm looking at, are heavily forested with wetlands and less crops and urban, compared to this regional land use change, which has less forest, less wetlands, more crops and urban. So the watersheds I'm studying are not representative of this whole region, but are just remnant populations of rice. So I'm working to contextualize my results and finalize those as I wrap up my dissertation. Especially in the context that we know European American settlement has brought widespread land use change that's often directly caused wild rice decline in ways that people have been able to see, such as raising water levels significantly and drowning out plants, or destroying rice beds through logging and such. So that ends the method section. And so we've been able to bring this back to the research collaboration, and I've been able to share this work and iterate on this work through many different events and come to this general understanding that Manoomin availability is declining across the region, in part related to climate change, in part related to land use change. This climate change will continue to negatively impact Manoomin, and we have with decreased density, we have less harvested. And I understand this is a really heartbreaking note to leave on, so I wanted to emphasize the caretaking strategies that are ongoing. There's work at Spur Lake with the Wisconsin DNR to test out different management strategies, and you can see the different test plots in that picture. Clam Lake worked to remove carp, and they brought back wild rice, and that's in Wisconsin. Ogeechee Lake in Minnesota has lowered the inlet and outlet dams and lowered water levels and brought back wild rice. Swamp Lake, they're working to dredge out the outlet and lower the water levels. And also the work of the MPCA in creating policies that protect Manoomin waters from sulfate and remove that threat as much as possible from rice so that it can grow in the face of these ongoing land use and climate change threats. And lastly, I just want to throw in that did look at the relationship between past harvest and present harvest, and there is a positive relationship. So thinking about how good harvesting practices may actually benefit rice. And so we've been able to bring this back into our community practices and share this work with others, and work towards healing and justice, and through sharing at American Geophysical Union conferences and in book chapters we've helped write, all to work towards our values of healing and justice in this work. So with that, I will say miigwech. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Well, great. Thank you, Maddie, for that wonderful presentation. So much just great information and knowledge, and really glad that you agreed to be here and share all of this with us today. So thank you for that. So who has questions for Maddie? I think You can go ahead and either put those in the chat if you would like me to ask Maddie that, or you, of course, are all welcome to unmute yourselves and just ask your questions directly.
Hi, Maddie. This is Sharon Stevens from the Climate Unit. Excellent, outstanding, knock it out of the park presentation. And I'm wondering if you are comfortable with sharing your slides. It's a lot of wonderful information, and I'd love to have an opportunity. I'm sure others would join me to sort of go through the slides again. I know this meeting is being recorded, but it's nice to have the slides available as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I'd happily share the slides, and I'm working to publish the results too. Our process is to really collaboratively publish, so it's just taking me a little bit long time for everybody to review and add to it. But I do really want to get it published too in a really shareable format. But I'm happy to share the slides.
Great, thank you, Maddie. What else? What other questions does everybody have here while we still have a couple minutes left?
Yeah, hi, Maddie. While we're waiting for other people to come up with their questions, which I suspect are going to be coming, I do want to take off a little bit on what you just referred to in terms of publishing the results that you came up with. I know that there is a sensitivity, an understandable sensitivity on the part of our Native American nations to publish, to go and do research on sovereign lands and then publish it in journals without the input from the people that you worked with. And I'm wondering how you and the people you collaborated with kind of approach that. What is your goal in terms of publishing the results? What does that look like in terms of your interactive collaborations here? I'm really interested to hear, what your thoughts and what their thoughts are on this too.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And that's a really important point. So I'm glad you asked that question. So we make sure to discuss that up front before we do any work. So that's part of our data sovereignty data discussion that's in our protocol in the beginning, that we agree that we will not publish any data that's on tribal reservation land that's collected with tribes on this project unless they have consent to work through or co-author that paper with us. And so, yeah, if they don't want us to, and the university does have, at this point with some of the data, like they do demand that we own it. So if the tribe is worried about it at all, we just do not collect that data. It's their data. Their resource managers can collect it, and they can do what they want with it. And we don't publish it because that is their right as a sovereign nation. For the data that we collect together, we, with presentations, with publications, work to co-author and get their approval. Right now, the data that I have is the 1854 data and Glyphbook data is all ceded territory data. That's all data that's already online that they've already shared publicly. And so that there's not a big sensitivity there, but I am including folks who've collected that data as co-authors, and they're helping review the manuscript. And everything that we've worked on together, their knowledge really strengthens the science because they have that in-depth knowledge of what this data is showing and can help explain it and think of the nuances or why, just the complications of the data. So they've really added to the papers. And so we co-author it in that way. But we're really mindful not to follow that model of extractive science where we go in, get the data, publish, and leave, and are the ones who benefits from the publication record, and it doesn't go back and serve the tribes. And so in that, also publishing is an academic goal, and sometimes it can support tribes' priorities, and so we pursue it when it supports tribes' priorities, but recognizing that there are other things that tribal folks might want from the relationship rather than just academic publications. And so making sure that we're prioritizing those things, such as presentations or attending community events or working with youth as other ways to give back and share that knowledge.
Well, if no one else has an immediate question, one of the things I was really struck by very quickly was that distinction you had in those two slides between your diagram of all the arrows and the following slide of the paradigm that you got back from Basile, was it?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was just really, really an interesting observation about how the different perspectives can be generated just depending on, on who you're talking to. And, it wouldn't have occurred to me that kind of difference in terms of the illustration. I thought there was really, really an interesting set of slides you presented there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's challenging to do work where you're like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm wrong, or I'm thinking about this in a totally different way, and it's very unsettling, but it's also really beautiful, and so much creativity can happen. And I think that's what science is really about. And so it's just been really profound to work with people who think very differently and come up with ways where we can understand each other and build from what we know with each other.
Hi, Maddie. This is Amanda Yord from DNR. Thank you for your presentation. It was really great to hear. I was just thinking through it, how you talked about how your research is healing wounds kind of created by Western science and the university. And we all here work for the state government, which has, created many wounds from Western science, but just from unjust government practices and all of the history of our state and our state government. And I think as individuals, it can feel kind of overwhelming to work within this system. But one thing that I took away from your presentation is that like true tribal collaboration takes a lot of consistency and a lot of time, and just like showing up and like really thinking about your values. So I don't know, I was just thinking like on a big level with all of our agencies, like it seems like it will take the same thing, like consistency, time, investment, allocation of people and resources on a big systemic level. So yeah, I was just wondering I know it's a big question, but what are your thoughts on that? Like what have you learned over the past, many years working on this during your PhD that we could maybe take from, or yeah, I don't know. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, how are we like working for the government? Like, obviously there's huge things that systemic shifts that need to happen. And you've seems like been part of that at the U of M, these shifts that are happening. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts for me on that? I guess I don't really have a question, just wondering.
Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Amanda. And I think you're spot on. It takes time and energy to build relationships. And I mean, so much of it feels huge, and I'm just one person. And how do you navigate that and make change? And I think I have learned so much from tribal resource managers who are constantly thinking about this, constantly working within systems that have caused tremendous amount of harm, and how do they keep going, and how do they keep pushing, and how do I support that? And one thing I've learned from them of this importance of relationships, and this work has been healing for, you could look at it at a university level, but you can also look at it at a person to person level. Like, it's been healing for me to do this work. And so in that way, because I've been able to bring my whole self, I've always had this tension with Western science where I felt like I had to leave my relational, emotional self at the door. But this collaboration has allowed me to bring that as a gift, as an asset, as a tool to this work. It doesn't take away from the science. And so I've been able to gain a lot of energy from that, and creating the space where more people can do that is infectious and joyful, and bringing more people in that way. But it does take a tremendous amount of work, and it feels like you're swimming upstream, especially in systems that are set up not to prioritize relationships and not to respect tribes. And so it's really hard, but I think it's those relationships that can sustain you, and the friendships that come from this work. Yeah, I mean, but I think it really takes a commitment, and a half commitment can be really harmful, where you're there and then you leave, or you're not really fully there. And so that's really hard, because I feel like the normal demands of a university job, or I imagine a state job, makes it so that you can't always fully be there. Like you have like other meetings to go to, other emails, or other obligations to the state. So it's really tricky to navigate. But I think showing up and being there and listening is the first step. And I know folks, some who are on this call too, or working on the sulfate stuff, have been doing that and showing up in the spaces and listening and consistently being there to take the feedback, recognizing that if there's anger directed at you, it's not necessarily about you personally, but it's about these systems. And being there to listen and build that relationship slowly over time and keep showing up is really important. I don't know if that answered your question, but there's some thoughts of things that you sparked within me. Thanks, Amanda.
Yes, thank you. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't really a question. A little bit of a ramble, but thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, I think that was some wonderful advice and experience and knowledge that you just shared with all of us. So thank you for being transparent and open and willing to kind of share your lessons learned and your experiences with all of us. So I do really appreciate your time, and we are a few minutes past 10, so I do think we should probably wrap up here. But it was just wonderful to have you here today, and I think that it seems like everyone is on the same page, that this was just really, I think, a really great, we learned some knowledge, but I think more it helps us too as just people, right? And so I really appreciate you bringing that perspective to our water issues talk. So congrats too on all the wonderful work you've been doing, and hopefully you can get through your collaborative paper and your dissertation, and I'm sure go on to wonderful things in the future here. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening and your kind words in the chat. Appreciate it.